Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of love, loss, and the unexpected twists and turns life can present. Enjoy the story. Nick Salvatore stood at the kitchen window, his knuckles white as he gripped his coffee mug. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the Chicago skyline in hues of pink and gold. But Nick saw none of it. His eyes were fixed on the driveway, watching as his wife's sleek BMW pulled in. The front door opened, and Sarah stumbled in, her designer heels dangling from one hand. Her dress, which had probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, was rumpled and stained. "Where the hell have you been?" Nick's voice was low, dangerous. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "Jesus, Nick, what are you, my father?" "It's 5 in the goddamn morning, Sarah. You didn't answer any of my calls." She waved a dismissive hand, nearly losing her balance. "I was out with the girls. Lost track of time." "The girls?" Nick scoffed. "You mean that pair of plastic Barbies you call friends? The ones who'd sell their own mothers for a line of coke?" Sarah's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "At least they know how to have fun. When's the last time you loosened up, Nick? Or are you too busy playing mob boss to remember what fun is?" The words hit Nick like a physical blow. He'd left that life behind years ago, built a legitimate business. But the past had a way of lingering, didn't it? "Go to bed, Sarah," he said, his voice weary. "We'll talk about this when you're sober." But Sarah was already stumbling towards their bedroom, leaving Nick alone with his thoughts and the first rays of sunlight creeping through the window. Nick sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. When had it all gone so wrong? He and Sarah had been happy once, hadn't they? But now they were like strangers sharing a house. The last time they'd made love, he couldn't even remember. Shaking his head, Nick grabbed his keys. He should head to the office. Being the boss didn't mean he could slack off. But as he stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit him, and he found himself turning away from his car. A walk. That's what he needed. Clear his head. His feet carried him towards the old neighborhood, to the market where he'd cut his teeth as a young man. It had changed, of course. Gentrification had swept through like a tidal wave, replacing the gritty charm with sleek cafes and artisanal cheese shops. But if he closed his eyes, Nick could still see it as it was. The bustling stalls, the shouts of vendors, the occasional scuffle that would break out. And he could see himself, barely out of his teens, swaggering through like he owned the place. In a way, he had. "Pay up, old man," young Nick growled, looming over a fruit vendor's stall. "Unless you want something unfortunate to happen to this nice setup you got here." The vendor, a weathered Italian immigrant, looked up at Nick with fear in his rheumy eyes. "Please, Mr. Salvatore, business has been slow. I don't have—" Nick's hand shot out, grabbing a handful of the man's shirt. "That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem. The boss wants his money. You gonna make me disappoint the boss?" A crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with a mix of fear and morbid fascination. Nick was aware of every eye on him, relishing the power. He was somebody here, somebody to be feared and respected. The vendor's trembling hands reached for a lockbox beneath the counter. Nick smirked, releasing his grip. "Smart choice, old-timer. See? Everybody wins when you play nice." As Nick pocketed the cash, a commotion at the edge of the crowd caught his attention. A young woman was pushing her way through, her face flushed with anger. "Leave him alone, you bully!" Nick turned, ready to put this upstart in her place, but the words died in his throat as he took in the sight before him. She was beautiful. Long, dark hair framed a heart-shaped face, and her eyes— God, her eyes were like fire, burning with righteous indignation. "And who might you be, Bella?" Nick drawled, recovering his composure. "None of your business," she spat. "Just leave Mr. Rossi alone. He works hard for his money, unlike some people." Nick's eyes narrowed. No one talked to him like that. No one. But instead of anger, he felt intrigued. "You got a name, Firecracker?" She glared at him for a long moment before answering. "Mary, my name is Mary." Nick smiled, slow and predatory. "Well, Mary, how about we make a deal? I'll leave old man Rossi alone, if you let me buy you a coffee." Mary's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious? I wouldn't be caught dead with the likes of you. Your loss, Nick shrugged, turning back to the vendor. Now where were we? Wait. Mary's hand on his arm sent a jolt through Nick's body. Fine, one coffee, but then you leave Mr. Rossi and all the other vendors alone. For good. Nick considered her offer, his eyes roaming over her face. There was something about this girl. Deal, he said finally, extending his hand. As Mary reluctantly shook it, neither of them realized that this moment would change both their lives forever. Nick blinked, the memory fading as he found himself standing in front of a dilapidated flower stall. It was the only remnant of the old market, stubbornly holding out against the tide of progress. Mary, he whispered, his heart clenching. How different would his life have been if he'd never let her go, if he'd been brave enough to leave everything behind and follow her. But that was ancient history now. He had responsibilities, a wife, troubled as their marriage was, a successful business. He couldn't dwell on might-have-beens. As Nick turned to leave, a flash of movement caught his eye. A small figure darted between the stalls, quick and furtive. Before he could react, he felt a tug at his pocket. Hey! He shouted, whirling around. A young girl, no more than 10 or 11, froze in her tracks. In her hand was Nick's wallet. Give that back, kid, Nick growled, falling easily into his old tough guy persona. But the girl surprised him. Instead of running, she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze defiantly. I was going to give it back, she said. You dropped it. I was trying to return it. Nick blinked, taken aback by her boldness. Oh yeah? And I'm supposed to believe that? The girl shrugged. Believe what you want, mister. But here. She held out the wallet. Cautiously, Nick took it, checking to make sure nothing was missing. To his surprise, it was all there. Cash, credit cards, everything. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. Looking back at the girl, he saw she was already turning to leave. Hey, wait a second. She paused, eyeing him warily. What's your name, kid? Emily, she said after a moment's hesitation. Nick pulled out $100 bill. Well, Emily, thank you for being honest. Here, take this. Emily's eyes widened at the sight of the money, but she made no move to take it. I don't need your charity, mister. Nick couldn't help but chuckle. The kid had spunk. He had to give her that. It's not charity. It's a reward for doing the right thing. Go on. Take it. Slowly, Emily reached out and took the bill. As she did, something fell from Nick's wallet. An old, creased photograph. Oh, that's my mom, Emily exclaimed, bending to pick it up. Nick felt his heart stop. What did you say? Emily held up the photo, a picture of Mary that Nick had kept hidden for over 2 decades. This lady, she looks just like my mom. Well, younger, but still. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Nick steadied himself against a nearby wall, his mind racing. It couldn't be, could it? Your mom, he said slowly. What's her name? Anna, Emily replied, looking at Nick curiously. Anna Moretti. Do you know her? Anna, not Mary. But the resemblance in the photo. Nick's head was spinning. Emily, he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. Where is your mom now? The girl's face fell. She's sick, in the hospital. I was trying to... She trailed off, looking ashamed. Nick understood immediately. The attempted theft, the reluctance to take his money. The kid was desperate. Which hospital? He asked. Emily hesitated, clearly unsure whether to trust him. Look, I might know your mom, Nick said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. I want to help. Please, Emily. Which hospital? Mercy General, Emily finally said. But they won't let me see her. They say kids aren't allowed in the ICU. Nick's jaw set. They'll let you in. Come on, kid. We're going to see your mom. As they climbed into Nick's car, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically. Again. The drive to Mercy General was tense, filled with Emily's nervous chatter and Nick's monosyllabic responses. His mind was racing, trying to piece together a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Nick turned to Emily. Listen, kid, let me do the talking, okay? Just trust me on this. Emily nodded, her earlier bravado replaced by a vulnerable hope that made Nick's heart ache. They strode into the hospital, Nick's confident gait and expensive suit parting the crowds like Moses and the Red Sea. At the ICU reception, a stern-faced nurse looked up at them. "Can I help you?" Nick leaned in, his voice low and authoritative. "I'm here to see Anna Moretti. This is her daughter." The nurse frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have strict rules about children in the ICU, and visiting hours don't start for another—" "Listen carefully," Nick interrupted, his eyes boring into hers. "My name is Nicholas Salvatore. Perhaps you've heard of me? No? Well, I can assure you your superiors have. Now you're going to let us in to see Miss Moretti, or I'm going to make some calls that will make your life very, very difficult. Are we clear?" The nurse's eyes widened in recognition. Nick Salvatore was indeed a name that carried weight in Chicago, both in legitimate circles and less savory ones. Of course, Mr. Salvatore. Right this way." As they followed the now flustered nurse, Emily looked up at Nick with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "How did you do that?" Nick shrugged, uncomfortable with the admiration in her eyes. "Sometimes it pays to have a reputation." They stopped outside a private room. "Here we are," the nurse said. "But please, try to keep the visit brief. Miss Moretti needs her rest." Nick nodded, his hand on the door handle. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay on the other side. The room was dim, the only sound the steady beep of monitors. And there, in the bed, lay a ghost from Nick's past. She was older, of course, lines etched at the corners of her eyes and mouth, and her once vibrant hair was streaked with gray. But there was no mistaking those features, that delicate bone structure. It was Mary. Or rather, it was Anna, Mary's daughter. The resemblance was uncanny. "Mom!" Emily rushed to the bedside, taking Anna's hand. Anna's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile spreading across her face. "Emily, how did you get here?" "I brought her," Nick said, stepping into view. Anna's gaze shifted to him, confusion giving way to shock, and then recognition. "Nick," she whispered. "Is it really you?" Nick moved closer, his heart pounding. "Yeah, it's me, but I'm a little confused here, Anna. You look just like someone I used to know." Anna's eyes filled with tears. "My mother. You knew my mother, didn't you? Mary?" The confirmation hit Nick like a physical blow. He sank into the chair beside the bed, his legs suddenly unable to support him. "Your mother," he repeated. "Mary was your mother, which means—" His eyes darted to Emily, then back to Anna. "How old are you, Anna?" 32, she said softly. Nick did the math quickly in his head. 32 years ago, it lined up perfectly with that last night he'd spent with Mary. "Am I—" He couldn't finish the question. Anna reached out, taking his hand. "I don't know," she admitted. "Mom never told me who my father was. But I always wondered. She had a picture of you, you know, hidden away in an old jewelry box. I found it after she died." Nick's mind was reeling. A daughter, possibly his daughter. And a granddaughter, a family he never knew he had. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Anna shook her head. "I don't know. She never talked about her past. But she always spoke of Chicago with a mix of longing and fear. I think she was protecting me. Protecting us both." Nick nodded slowly. It made sense. The life he'd been living back then. It wasn't safe for a child. Mary had done what she thought was best. "Mr. Salvatore?" A doctor appeared in the doorway. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Nick stood, squeezing Anna's hand before following the doctor into the hallway. "I understand you're covering Miss Moretti's medical expenses?" the doctor asked. Nick nodded. He'd made some calls while Emily was visiting with her mother. "Whatever she needs, spare no expense. And I want a DNA test done, discreetly." The doctor's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Salvatore. We'll take care of everything." As Nick returned to the room, he found Emily curled up next to her mother on the bed, both of them dozing lightly. The sight stirred something in him, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. Whatever the DNA test showed, Nick knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. The drive home was silent, Emily having fallen asleep in the back seat. Nick's mind was a whirlwind of emotions and half-formed plans. He needed to talk to Sarah, to explain— What? That he might have a daughter and granddaughter? That he was prepared to upend their entire lives for a family he'd just discovered? As he pulled into the driveway, Nick saw Sarah's car was gone. Probably out with her girls again. In a way, he was relieved. It would give him time to gather his thoughts. He gently shook Emily awake. "Come on, kid. Let's get you inside." Emily rubbed her eyes, looking around in confusion. "Where are we?" "My house," Nick said. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next." As they entered the house, Sarah's voice rang out from the living room. "Nick, is that you? Where the hell have you been all day?" Nick winced. So much for having time to prepare. "In here, Sarah. And I've got someone with me." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with anger and too much wine. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of Emily. "What is this?" she demanded. "Who is she?" Nick took a deep breath. "Sarah, this is Emily. She might be my granddaughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally rage. "You're what?" she hissed. "Have you lost your mind, Nick? We don't have any children, let alone grandchildren." "It's complicated," Nick said, his voice steady. "I just found out today. Her mother, Anna, she might be my daughter, from before I met you." Sarah laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Of course. Another skeleton in the closet of the great Nick Salvatore. And let me guess, you're going to play the noble savior now? Throw away everything we've built for some stranger?" Emily shrank back, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Nick placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "That's enough, Sarah," he said firmly. "Emily, why don't you go upstairs? First door on the right. There's a guest room where you can rest." Emily nodded, casting a wary glance at Sarah before scurrying up the stairs. As soon as they heard the door close, Sarah rounded on Nick. "Have you completely lost your mind? You can't just bring some random child into our home." Nick's jaw clenched. "She's not random, Sarah. She's family." "Family?" Sarah scoffed. "You don't even know if this girl's mother is actually your daughter. This could all be some elaborate con to get your money." "It's not like that," Nick insisted. "You should see Anna. The resemblance to Mary, it's uncanny." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Mary? Who the hell is Mary?" Nick sighed, realizing he'd opened another can of worms. "Someone I knew a long time ago, before you." "Oh, wonderful!" Sarah threw her hands up. "So not only are you bringing strangers into our home, but you're pining after some old flame? Tell me, Nick, is there anything else you'd like to confess while we're at it?" Nick felt his patience wearing thin. "You know what, Sarah? I'm done explaining myself to you. I'm done pretending that this marriage is anything more than a sham." Sarah recoiled as if she'd been slapped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Nick's voice was low and controlled, "that I'm filing for divorce. I think we both know this has been a long time coming." For a moment, Sarah looked genuinely hurt, but then her face hardened. "Fine," she spat. "You want to throw away 20 years for some bastard child and her brat? Be my guest. But don't think for a second that I'm going to walk away empty-handed." "You'll get what you're entitled to," Nick said coldly. "Nothing more, nothing less. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a guest to attend to." As he turned to head upstairs, Sarah called out, "You'll regret this, Nick. Mark my words." Nick paused at the foot of the stairs. Without turning around, he said, "The only thing I regret is not doing this years ago." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Nick threw himself into caring for Anna and Emily with a passion that surprised even him. He hired the best doctors, arranged for Anna to be moved to a private room with round-the-clock care, and enrolled Emily in the most prestigious private school in Chicago. As Anna's health improved, Nick found himself spending more and more time at the hospital. They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of their shared history. Nick told her about his relationship with Mary, about the life he'd left behind to become a legitimate businessman. Anna shared stories of growing up with Mary, of the warmth and love that had defined their little family of two. "She never spoke badly of you, you know," Anna said one afternoon. "When I asked about my father, she would just get this faraway look in her eyes and say that he was a good man who had to make some hard choices." Nick felt a lump form in his throat. She was always too good for me, he said softly. I think that's why I let her go. I knew she deserved better than the life I could offer her back then. Anna reached out, taking his hand. Maybe, or maybe she was exactly what you needed to become the man you are now. As the days turned into weeks, Nick found himself falling easily into the role of father and grandfather. He helped Emily with her homework, beaming with pride when she brought home top marks. He took her to baseball games, teaching her to keep score just as his own father had taught him. And every night, as he tucked Emily into bed in what had once been a cold, impersonal guest room, but was now decorated with posters and stuffed animals, Nick felt a sense of peace he'd never known before. One evening, as Nick was preparing dinner, Emily perched on a stool at the kitchen island, swinging her legs as she watched him. "Nick?" she said hesitantly. "Yeah, kiddo? Can I call you Grandpa?" Nick nearly dropped the spatula he was holding. He turned to Emily, his heart swelling with emotion. "Of course you can, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick. "I'd be honored." Emily beamed, hopping off the stool to throw her arms around him. "Thanks, Grandpa." As Nick held her close, he couldn't help but chuckle. "Just don't call me that in public, okay? I've got a reputation to maintain." Emily giggled. "Okay, Nick, our secret." The moment was interrupted by the ringing of Nick's phone. He glanced at the caller ID. It was the hospital. "Hello?" he answered, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "Mr. Salvatore?" It was Anna's doctor. "I have the results of the DNA test you requested." Nick's heart began to race. And there was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Mr. Salvatore. The test shows that you are not Anna's biological father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Nick gripped the counter for support, aware of Emily's concerned gaze. "I see," he managed to say. "Thank you, doctor." As he hung up the phone, Nick felt a moment of crushing disappointment. But as he looked at Emily, still watching him with those big, trusting eyes, he made a decision. "Is everything okay, Nick?" she asked. Nick smiled, ruffling her hair affectionately. "Everything's perfect, kiddo. Now how about we finish making this dinner and then plan our trip to the mall tomorrow? I think it's time we got you a new backpack for school." Emily's face lit up. "Really? Can we get ice cream too?" "You bet," Nick laughed. "But don't tell your mom. It'll be our little secret." As they continued preparing dinner together, Nick felt a sense of contentment wash over him. Biology didn't matter. This was his family now, and he'd do anything to protect and cherish them. Later that night, as Nick climbed into bed, he glanced at the framed photo on his nightstand. It was a recent picture of him with Anna and Emily, all three of them laughing at some shared joke. Next to it was the old creased photo of Mary. "Thank you," he whispered to Mary's image, "for giving me a second chance at happiness." As he drifted off to sleep, Nick Salvatore, once a feared enforcer, now a doting grandfather, looked forward to tomorrow and all the days after, filled with the love and laughter of the family he never knew he needed.